So this year is off to a turbulent start, and a new global risk report by the Eurasia Group is sounding the alarm, calling 2026 a tipping point. In an unusual shift, it identifies the United States as the principal threat to the global order and offers a stark warning as President Trump tests the limits of his own executive power. Ian Bremmer is the group's founder and president. He joins Walter Isaacson to break down what he calls the American political revolution.
Thank you, Christian and Ian Bremmer. Welcome back to the show.
Walter, great to see you.
Well, let's start with Venezuela, of course, and the capture of President Maduro. You referred to it in your beginning of the year report as the Monroe Doctrine, of course, referring to James Monroe's doctrine of the 1820s that we should have South America or all the Western Hemisphere as a sphere of influence. Could we go back to that type of sphere of influence? Does this make sense?
We couldn't go back to it on the economic side because China, of course, is the dominant trade partner with most of the countries in the Western Hemisphere, and they're not about to leave. Mexico, of course, the U.S. has been pushing hard against Chinese transshipments. The Mexicans, really reliant on the United States, have significantly increased their tariffs against China. But that's, broadly speaking, not going to work. Militarily, of course, the U.S. is dominant, and not only in the Western Hemisphere. And that is exactly where Trump just had a staggering success with a 6-month in-process plan to remove Maduro and bring him to see justice in the United States. And other countries in the region are absolutely put on notice as a consequence of that. And not just in the Western Hemisphere. This is a Greenland issue, too. Trump has made very clear that he intends to have Greenland. He wants sovereignty over it, and he's not debating that with the Danes right now. So this is a really big shift to the law of the jungle in America's backyard.
Well, wait a minute. You said it's a staggering success, just called it the law of the jungle. But, man, you say the law of the jungle is dangerous. What applies to your enemies one day can apply to you the next. Make no mistake where the world is heading here.
Yeah, well, staggering success for Trump in a headline is very different from U.S. influence in 5 or 10 years. I mean, Trump is clearly really pleased that Maduro is out and that whatever next government comes in, so not regime change, more like regime roulette, is going to do America's bidding, or else that military can be used against them. So he sees that as a win. But long term, the United States is not China. It's not Russia. It doesn't have leaders for life. It has elections every 4 years. And just as Trump did to Biden, and Biden did to Trump before him, and Trump did to Obama, the next president can change things. And when you have an independent judiciary, when you have an election cycle, when you have two different political parties, you don't want to have law of the jungle. You want to actually be constrained by rule of law with institutions that you set up because they align with you over the long term. Unfortunately, Trump's efforts to secure a law of the jungle in a G0 world, as I put it, long term is much more beneficial for the Chinese than it is for the United States.
Well, wait, you say it's beneficial to the Chinese. You said we're not going to be able to have economic dominance. But the Chinese, who have lent large billions of dollars to Venezuela based on oil revenues, they now seem like they're going to be cut out of this equation.
Well, actually, in the hours after Maduro was removed, despite the U.S. boycott on tanker traffic, over 12 tankers were allowed out. That was by the United States to ship over oil to China. And Trump said the Chinese will be able to get their oil. The United States is quite excited now. Trump is going to go to Beijing and meet with Xi Jinping coming up in April. And this relationship is precisely what Trump calls a G2 now. Why is he affording the Chinese such incredible deference when he's beating up on Venezuela and he's beating up on his own allies? And the reason, of course, is because the Chinese have shown the willingness and the capability to hit the Americans back hard. So there's a really big difference between Trump announcing FAFO, fool around and find out, to Nicolas Maduro, and people talking about taco. Trump always chickens out when you discuss how the Americans need to back down to the Chinese. And the real question, if you want to think, Walter, about how the U.S. will engage with other countries around the world, is where do they fall on that spectrum between FAFO and TACO? The Europeans today, at least from America's perspective, look a lot more FAFO-like, and that is a problem for Europe.
Stephen Miller just said Greenland should obviously be part of the U.S. and that nobody is going to fight the United States over the future of Greenland. So when we speak next year on this day, who's going to control Greenland?
We don't know. There's no plan for taking over Greenland, but Trump says he wants one. And that means American sovereignty over Greenland.
What would that mean to NATO then?
Well, it would be a disaster, of course, for the non-American NATO countries. Now, that doesn't mean boots on the ground. I don't think anyone is talking about an invasion. But there's lots of ways to have influence over a country and get what you want if you're so much more powerful as the United States is. Political inducements and economic inducements, but also threats. And what we've seen is that the U.S. has cut off their negotiations with the Danes. They don't want to discuss this with Denmark. This is the Alice through the looking glass part of all of this, is if what Trump wanted were more access for U.S. bases in Greenland, more ability to have intelligence surveillance, if he needed access for the Americans to exploit Greenland natural wealth and resource, all of that is on the table by just sitting down and negotiating with Denmark.
This law of the jungle where might makes right and we have the right to do these things, you said that could backfire on us. Let me read you something that was on China's social media platforms, postings that were allowed by the censor to stay on the platforms. One of them read, "If the United States can arrest another country's president, then China can absolutely arrest Taiwan's president." And then there was a comment following up saying, it's not that China is not able to, it's that China doesn't dare to. Do you think this Venezuela action might embolden China to do something similar on Taiwan?
Not in the near term, no. And that's why this isn't in the report. China, of course, sees Taiwan as a domestic policy issue, not a foreign policy issue. So they certainly believe it's within their rights to do whatever they want with Taiwan. But they also understand that Taiwan is an island. It's very heavily fortified and defended. And it also matters a lot economically to China, especially TSMC and their semiconductor production, all of which is an unacceptable risk for the Chinese to take against the United States, Venezuela or no Venezuela. So this is really a capabilities issue. And it's the fact that the Chinese are long-term players. They're patient and they're building their capabilities. They're biding their time with the intention of making a move on Taiwan when they believe it is to their advantage. That time is not today.
How does this Venezuela situation sort of affect Russian relations, and even the sense that maybe Russia should have its sphere of influence, including large parts of Ukraine?
Well, I'm going to give you a similar answer, which is, again, the Russians didn't need the Americans to make them feel like they deserve a sphere of influence. And they invaded Ukraine initially in 2014 with the illegal Crimean annexation and the little green men in Donbass. They saw that the Europeans, the Americans didn't do very much about it. So then they went back for a second, much bigger bite at the apple in 2022, the full-on invasion. All of this comes well before Venezuela. So, I mean, Trump, it was interesting to see the Russians publicly, the Kremlin, condemn the United States for this breach of international law, something the Russians have a great deal of expertise on in history, of course, themselves. But the Russian problem is that their military is nowhere close to as capable as the American military. I mean, if the Russians could have come close to pulling off against Zelensky what the Americans did to Maduro, you and I would be having a very different conversation right now about Ukraine and about Russia's future. But Russia's kleptocracy, its incapacity, its lack of wealth and productivity, and its lack of human capital, so much of which has died on the battlefield or has got the hell out of Dodge because they're so scared of what would happen to them if they're drafted, that really undermines Russia's future. So they're gaining some land in Ukraine, but Russia's losing everywhere else in the world.
The next application of the Donroe Doctrine might be Cuba. That's where it would make sense. What do you think is going to happen there? Cuba got, I think, a quarter of its oil and a lot of its resources from Venezuela.
Yeah, that's going to stop. And we heard that Cubans were killed in the American operations in Venezuela, and they were providing a lot of intelligence and military advice to the Venezuelans. Certainly, Marco Rubio believes that there is a domino theory that you get rid of Maduro and you get rid of the leaders in Nicaragua, and Cuba is the ultimate, sort of last shoe to fall. There are a lot of leaders across Latin America that are aligned with President Trump. You just saw that election in Chile. You've got Milei in Argentina. In Colombia, elections this year will almost certainly lead to a right-wing pro-Trump figure as opposed to Petro, who we can't stand. But Cuba, they're not having elections. And for the Americans to deal with that, you're going to have to engage in some level of direct intervention. Now, whether that starts with an economic blockade or whether that starts with diplomacy and give you an ultimatum, they don't have that plan yet. But I certainly expect that over the coming year, that plan is going to be drawn up.
Mexico is an interesting case for the Donroe Doctrine. He seems to be rather friendly with Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum, and yet he put it in the crosshairs in some of his comments this week. Tell me what to make of that.
I think that Claudia Sheinbaum has done a masterful job of understanding that she is in a very vulnerable position, that she needs the Americans. She has nowhere else to go. She doesn't have a China play. She doesn't have a Europe play. It's all about trade with the United States, remittances from Mexicans living in the United States. That's tourism, you name it. And so she's worked very hard to do as much as possible to shut down fentanyl, to secure and police the border, to listen to the Americans on transshipment of goods from China through Mexico. She's putting higher tariffs on Chinese goods coming in, everything that she possibly can. But she has a red line, and that red line is Mexican sovereignty, that the Americans cannot send drones in, cannot send the federales in to fight directly against the narco cartels. They have to work with Mexico together. But I will tell you that Trump in the first months was thinking about maybe we want to just use force in Mexico. In the last couple months, we've heard internally people, including Stephen Miller, say that Mexico is cooperating so well with the Americans that maybe we don't need to invade unilaterally. Maybe we can just work with them. And that is a testament to Claudia Sheinbaum working very hard and effectively, and her cabinet, with the United States.
Your very first item on your risk list is the domestic political situation in the United States. It reminds me of the old Pogo cartoon. You may not be old enough to remember it, but we have met the enemy and he is us. Yeah. Yes. And so to what extent do you think we're going through a political revolution that is a threat to our international standing?
Whether or not the revolution is successful, the reality of America struggling internally is making it much less reliable internationally. And this is the problem, that, Americans may not agree on which part of America is the enemy, but they seem to increasingly agree that the enemy is not Russia, China, North Korea, Iran. The principal enemy is inside the house. And Trump in particular really believes, and a lot of his supporters believe, that the government was weaponized against him, that these two unprecedented impeachments, the felonies and the convictions, again unprecedented, and the near assassination occurred because Biden and the Democrats weaponized the power of government against him. And so he now believes that he must weaponize the administrative state, politicize it, as well as the Department of Justice, the FBI, the power ministries in the U.S., to ensure that they can never come back to power and do that to him. And that is a very dangerous position for the U.S. It means that he is trying to break the checks and balances against the presidency. And so far, he's done a lot more of that than anyone would have expected a year ago, Walter. And the reaction, there has been pushback, but there's been less pushback than anyone would have expected a year ago. And that makes this political revolution.
And you
real
expected
risk.
a year ago. You said it was a bit overstated that our democracy's institutions would fall apart, that there were guardrails. Are you surprised at how problematic it was having the guardrails that protect our democratic institutions?
I'll say that I'm a little bit surprised. I still think this political revolution will ultimately fail. I think Trump doesn't have the popularity, the ability to see it through, and that there are still guardrails. I think that the judges in the United States, you're going to see the Supreme Court rule on IEPA. You've just seen Trump be pushed back on using the National Guard in Chicago, for example. You saw his investigations against Letitia James and Comey get pushed back. So there has been some. The U.S. is a federal system. The states matter. They're red and blue, but they are more technocratic in the way they are governed. And that also means the way that elections occur. But when I look at the weakness of the Democratic Party, when I look at the inability and unwillingness of the Republican Party to be anything but completely loyal to Trump, when I see that the CEOs and the bankers are privately very concerned and wring their hands, but publicly won't criticize, when I see the role of the corporate media rolling over and paying off lawsuits that they know they could win, but they don't want to be threatened, or they want to make sure they get a new merger deal together, when I see the threat by Trump against public television, which you and I care a great deal about, all of those things do imply that we are in unprecedented times.
You write, let me give you the quote, with only 3 years left and Democrats favored to take the House of Representatives in November's midterm elections, Trump and his inner circle will grow more, not less, risk acceptant. Tell me what you expect.
Well, it's kind of like what we just saw on Venezuela, that, you know, when Trump feels like he's not succeeding in one area, he doesn't sort of give up. He doubles down in another. And I think that Trump's impulses, just as you saw after he lost the election in 2020, and he didn't give up and go quietly into the night. He said, no, I'm rallying my people, and we're going to do everything we can to overturn this fake election that has been rigged against me. I don't think anyone that knows Trump thinks that this guy isn't a fighter. This guy was almost killed again, and he got back up immediately and raises his fist in the air, and it's right in the West Wing. Big photograph. You go in, and you know there's the in the White House. There's this massive painting of Trump fighting. I think that Trump feels like, you know, he has everything to lose if the Democrats come back, and he's going to do everything in his power with a lot of people that are much more loyal to him around him in his administration than they were in the first term to fight. To ensure that his political revolution is successful.
Ian Bremmer, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Walter.
260 million. That's how many Americans are predicted to be either overweight or obese by 2050. It's a dire warning from medical experts, but can drugs like Ozempic offer a way out? Or does a lack of regulation mean they could cause more harm than good? Dr. David Kessler is a former FDA commissioner who was instrumental in enacting tough tobacco regulations under President Clinton and later led President Biden's COVID response. He joins Hari Srinivasan to discuss his new book on the obesity crisis.
Bianna, thanks. Dr. David Kessler, thanks so much for joining us. Your new book is titled Diet, Drugs, and Dopamine, The New Science of Achieving a Healthy Weight. And you're looking really kind of a little bit more holistically at nutrition and weight loss. And I guess, why did you feel the need to write this book right now?
You know, the American body is ill. Only about 12% of Americans are metabolically healthy. And there's a real opportunity to reclaim our health. That's why I wrote the book.
I mean, how much of the population is suffering in these different ways? I mean, our statistics say that we're talking as of 2023, 40% of American adults over the age of 20 are considered obese. How did we get to this point? I mean, is it the fact that ultra-processed foods have been introduced to diet, how long they've been there, how culturally accepted they are?
Let's understand one thing. This is not about weight. It's not how big you are or small you are. To me, it's about health. The question is, really about toxic fat, sick fat. It's the fat in our midsection. It's the fat that gets into our liver, into our pancreas, into layers of our heart that cause many of the chronic diseases: cardiac, kidney, metabolic, certain forms of cancer, and possibly even neurodegenerative diseases. So it's toxic fat. This is not about weight.
Can you explain a little bit medically what's happening with that kind of belly fat or deep fat, visceral fat, whatever it's called? What is it actually doing? How is it kind of actively working against my health, more than just the fact that, oh, I have a few pounds now overall spread out from my body? What's the danger of it being right here in my midsection?
This midsection fat, as you just referred to it, this toxic fat, it's different than some of the fat that's under our skin and our arms and in our legs. This fat, these fat cells have a hard time because of the just amount of calories we're taking in, holding on to all the lipids, to all the fat. So they leak these molecules. They leak certain pro-inflammatory molecules, and those molecules in that fat, are getting into our vital organs. Doctors, whether it's cardiologists, nephrologists, neurologists, oncologists, we're all waking up to the fact that this toxic fat getting into our vital organs, that our organs are bathed in this inflammatory soup that these cells are leaking out. It's really causing metabolic chaos in our bodies. This beer belly, we always, became part of the culture. Thought it was cool. Men were strong. It's really killing us.
If you look at this as an addictive set of substances that are causing the worst of this midsection and toxic fat, should we be looking at this as something that's able to change our brain chemistry?
I think we could all relate to the experience. Food is very powerful. Whether it's neurochemistry or the neurocircuits, I think we need to rethink how we talk about addiction. Addiction was always something, that was the weak, the downtrodden. In fact, these addictive circuits are part of all of us. Thousands of years ago, our brains evolved to deal with an environment of scarcity. The brains that could focus our attention on finding this energy-dense food in an environment of scarcity, that was great for survival. It's not that our brains today are not working well or something's broken about them. They're working only too well because we've changed this food environment to put these energy-dense foods, through, 24/7, we're exposed to it. There are certain elements of addiction. There's something called cue-induced wanting. What's a cue? It could be the time of day. It could be I passed a certain store. It could be a smell. I wasn't even thinking about it, but my brain unconsciously gets cued. And based on past learning and past memory, that cue stimulates this wanting. And all of a sudden I have thoughts, maybe I should go into that store. Maybe I should have that food. And until you, actually consume it, those thoughts stay with you. If you have the food available 24/7, you don't even feel the pull, of these. But when you try to resist, I would always lose weight. I've gained and lost my body weight multiple times. I would lose the weight. I was done, I thought, and I would always gain it back. One of the things about addiction, is there's relapse. And when you're dealing with food, it's really about that regaining food. Yes, there's metabolic adaptation, but these reward circuits, they're just part of all of us.
So if this is an addictive substance and it's engineered to be more so, what's the role of the government here? Should this industry be regulated more closely? We're doing it for alcohol and for tobacco.
I had the privilege, of being part of the team that, as you said, did the investigation into tobacco. No doubt that there are certain tools the government has that can change our relationship with these addictive substances. But what really worked in tobacco? It was one of the great public health successes, over the last 100 years. At the turn of the previous century, what the tobacco companies did was, they hired the psychoanalyst A.A. Brill to come up, with the phrase, symbols of liberty, torches of freedom. There was the march down Fifth Avenue for emancipation. They made cigarettes into something that was sexy, adventuresome, glamorous. There was the Marlboro man. They made it positively valenced. And what happens when something's positively valenced and it's addictive? You want it. What did we do over the last 50, 75 years? Right? We changed the valence. We changed the tobacco. There was this critical perceptual shift from something I wanted, that was my friend, to something that I didn't want. There was a deadly, disgusting product. It was my enemy. So how we perceive these foods, are these foods really satisfying me? What are they doing to my body? Do I really want them? I think, yes, there's government tools that you can use, but we really have to change how we see these foods.
Let's turn our conversation a little bit to GLP-1 drugs. And you write it really in a fantastic kind of personal voice about your personal journey with these drugs. How do the sort of semaglutides, the tirzepatides, how do they work? And what has been your experience with them?
What they do is, the scientific term is, they delay gastric emptying. That just simply says that food stays in your stomach longer. And we all have experienced that. We get the flu. Our GI tract doesn't move as much. Food stays in our stomach. And how do you feel? You don't want to put anything else, in your stomach. There is this spectrum. And it's the result of both the GI tract and part of the brain, the hindbrain. That continuum of, I feel satisfied, I feel full. And then it's this Thanksgiving fullness. Everybody perceives these differently, but for me, they took me to the edge of nausea. What's strong enough to overcome the addictive circuits, right? There are another set of circuits in the body called the aversive circuits. The circuits that, when we feel ill. In fact, when the first early, precursors of these drugs were given to laboratory animals, the animals didn't move. Scientists, coined the term visceral malaise, this general illness. And what the great thing is about these drugs, because of the dose, they can push you along that continuum, fullness, satiety. Some people can't tolerate these drugs because they push them over, into outright nausea. But those feelings are strong enough to, overcome the reward circuits. The problem is these drugs only work while you're on them. And the latest data that I saw is that the average person in this country is on them for 8 or 9 months. You go off them, and they stop working. But the premise of the company are that you're going to be on that for your life. I think that the FDA and the companies have to study how we can effectively use these drugs in the real world.
You're describing a couple of different processes here. One is kind of the physiological. If there's more food in my stomach and I feel full, I don't feel like I'm going to put more calories in, right? And then the other is, what's interesting to me is kind of this idea of food noise, right? Decreasing your interest in going after all foods, including the hyper addictive ones. So I wonder, when you got off the drugs, did that food noise increase?
You said it very well. That food noise is the result of those reward circuits, those addictive circuits. I mean, those are just that cue-induced wanting. I've been going off in my head that my reward circuits, are being triggered. And those aversive circuits, that edge of nausea that I felt, that sort of counterbalance those addictive circuits, that works when you're on these drugs. And they'll work for a while after you go off them. But at a certain point, this is highly variable. We're each, every individual has their own experiences. For me, it worked for a while, but what I've found and what I've tried to do is to change my relationship with food while I'm on that, what I want, and try to have that sort of condition me in a way to be able to carry over. But, I had the opportunity to co-lead Operation Warp Speed. During the pandemic, I worked 18-hour days. I was sitting there at my computer. I didn't get up, it was 7 days a week. And I turned around and I was some 40 pounds heavier afterwards. And I wanted to do something about this. These drugs are not a panacea. Right? There's no magic pill. They're one tool, right? You need to take them. You can't expect to deal with these addictive circuits by yourself. You need a team. You need a good physician. You need a dietitian. You need people who can help you to change the relationship with food. And the drugs are one tool, but only one tool.
We are having this conversation about these drugs. One of the things that I definitely want to point out is that, we might have access to them, but it's very unequal access. For most people, their insurance does not cover the GLP-1 drugs. It might cover it for diabetes, but it might not cover it for weight loss.
This is not about willpower. This is very much a disease process at work, and it's causing enormous trillions of dollars of health bills these insurance companies are paying. I think one of the first things the administration has to do is to agree under Medicare to cover these drugs. Not to do that is a form of discrimination against people who struggle with obesity. We need to provide access to these drugs. I was carrying 3 different insurance policies, and not one covered these drugs. They were, over $1,000. Could you imagine struggling with your weight your whole life and being ill from it? From suffering, the cardiac consequences, the renal consequences, pre-diabetes, diabetes, and a number of other complications. A drug comes along and it can help you, and you can't have access to that drug. So, it just shows you how broken the American health system is. The companies, what do? They price these drugs, exorbitantly. And there is this thing in the food and drug laws, is sort of this loophole that allows what's called compounded drugs to be made. These are drugs, not coming from the manufacturers. The source of these drugs are probably coming from China. It's hard to even know where these are, in some cases, being made. The FDA has not done testing to assure the safety. So because the drug companies have priced these drugs so high, people had to resort to drugs that they couldn't assure the safety of. Now the companies are lowering their prices to compete with these compounded drugs. That it just shows you how broken the healthcare system is.
So is there something where we can collectively figure out how to increase access to this category of drugs while at the same time, equipping people, preparing people for a way for them to say, okay, we understand that the manufacturer says you need to be on this drug for the rest of your life, But our goal is not to have you on this drug for the rest of your life. I want you to just figure out in this interim, like, let's get you back to a healthy level. And hopefully between now and that point, we can change your relationship with food.
You've just said it wonderfully. I mean, that's the goal, but it's a journey. There is no end game right now. You and I are not going to figure out, how to you get the data to use these drugs, the right dose, whether it's safe to take that dose down. Can I go off the drug? When can I go back? Will it continue to work? Those are questions the drug company, along with the regulatory bodies, need to figure out. What our job is to do is to want to be able to deal with this toxic fat, with this sick fat, to reclaim our health, and to get a team. Again, access is a very key issue. You can't deal with an addictive substance alone. You need docs, you need nutritionists. That's what we need to do. We just have to want to reclaim our health and understand there's no end game. It's a real journey.
Former FDA Commissioner Dr. David Kessler, his new book is called Diet, Drugs, and Dopamine, The New Science of Achieving a Healthy Weight. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, this week marks 80 years since U.S. atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, devastating two of Japan's major cities and killing an estimated 200,000 people. While this brought an end to the Second World War, the tragic legacy of the bombings still lingers today. Now, historian Garrett Graff takes us back to that pivotal moment in his new book, The Devil Reached Toward the Sky. Gathers hundreds of accounts of those involved in the bombings, from the crews of the B-29 bombers to the decision makers. He joins Walter Isaacson to discuss the scientific, political, deeply personal impact of how the bombs came to be.
Thank you, Bianna and Garrett Graff. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Walter.
This is your third oral history book. You did one on D-Day, you did one on 9/11. Why the format of an oral history, especially when you're not really interviewing most of the people, it's gathering their interviews from the past?
Exactly. This book is coming, of course, at the 80th anniversary this month of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings and the end of World War II. And I think this 80th anniversary feels so poignant to a lot of people because it marks the unofficial passing of the last of that greatest generation. And so for me, what I wanted to do with this project and with my D-Day book last year was, this is a moment when we have effectively every first-person memory of World War II that we're ever going to have. And so as these events slip from living memory into history, I wanted to try to take readers back to these epochal events in the shoes of the people who lived them firsthand. I love narrative history, but there's often a sense in narrative history that events are sort of neater, cleaner, and more preordained than they actually felt to any of the participants at the time. So I think there's a unique power in oral history of sort of going back in the words of the people who lived them to a moment when the outcome of these events was uncertain to them. So, you're going back and sort of hearing from the physicists at moments when, like, they didn't know whether Adolf Hitler would get the bomb first. They didn't know that the U.S. and the Allies would even win World War II. They didn't know whether the atom bomb would work at all.
What did you discover that was slightly different by doing it based on them talking at the time?
Yeah, I think one of the things that you really come through when you look at the sort of diversity of voices in a project like this is, I think we oversimplify the story of the Manhattan Project so often to J. Robert Oppenheimer and his band of merry physicists on a mesa in Los Alamos. And what you really see in this full scope and scale of the Manhattan Project is how much of this was about America's industrial might. the secret cities that we built in Oak Ridge, Tennessee and Hanford, Washington, where we refined uranium and plutonium, in factories and facilities and cities that had been carved out of, orchards and, mountain valleys, that by the end of the war housed and employed 100,000 people apiece. The bus system in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, in August 1945, when the atomic bomb was dropped, was one of the 10 largest public transit systems in the United States. And no one knew it existed at all, and the city didn't appear on any public map anywhere in the United States.
Just hearing that and reading it in your book makes me think, could we ever do that anymore? I mean, we can't build a rail system in California after 20 years.
Yeah, and I think that there is a lot to be said about what this era meant in terms of sort of news consumption and, the ability of these mountain communities and desert communities in Eastern Washington to keep secrets back then that could never hold in the age of the internet. But I do think that there is, there's some very important modern relevances of looking back at this project today. First, the Manhattan Project rewrites the way that government thinks about science and technology as a core national strength. There's this deep irony in the first couple of years of the book where you have this group of mostly Jewish refugee scientists fleeing Europe, showing up on the shores of the United States in the late 1930s and sort of pleading with the U.S. government to launch an atomic bomb effort, and the military wanting nothing to do with it. And they sort of say, basically like, science has no place in the military. The military is all about, war fighting and logistics and morale. And, we don't need a weapon like this. And then, of course, the military gets pretty excited about the atomic bomb a few months later after Pearl Harbor.
One of the people who changes that, and you got him in the book, is Vannevar Bush, who compared this to building the pyramids. And he's the one who puts together that government, private, academic consortium that does so much. Tell me about his role.
Yeah, this is, of course, where America's sort of begins to knit together government and science and technology. There's a quote in the introduction of the book where, the story that we tell of World War II is about where the battles are fought. Bastogne, D-Day, Leyte Gulf, Okinawa.
Yeah, but Omaha Beach.
Exactly. But where the war is really won is in laboratories at MIT where radar and the proximity fuse are developed. It's won in the laboratories at Los Alamos and in the code breaking rooms of Bletchley Park in the UK with the German Enigma. And that, as much as we think of World War II as a story of the servicemen in Europe and the Pacific, it really is a war that is as much a story of scientists and mathematicians.
But it's not just the scientists in your book. What really struck me was like the Ford Motor Plant and Willow Run and our ability, which I feel we've lost a little bit now, to do manufacturing at scale quickly.
Yes, and that's really where the magic of the Manhattan Project comes in. I mean, there's a reason that the Manhattan Project today remains a code word for daring and audacity, and part of that is in these early months you have physicists at the University of Chicago beginning to map out on pieces of paper. I mean, remember, this is an era, they're all working with slide rulers. There are not computers that are aiding this engineering for most of the war. And with their slide rulers and butcher paper, they are starting to map out how to build and refine plutonium in orders of kilograms at a time when plutonium has never actually been even seen by the naked human eye, and it literally exists in the United States only in microscopic amounts.
You talk about those people who convinced the military, and for that matter, President Roosevelt, to do the bomb, a lot of them the Jewish refugees. Tell me about the role of refugees and whether that has some relevance today, too, when we're not allowing in as many foreign scientists.
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, this in too many places feels like a history book that should be filed under current events in the bookstore. Because, again, this atomic bomb project would have never gotten off the ground without the leadership and the imagination of the Jewish refugee scientists who flee fascist Europe, come to the United States in the 1930s and 40s. And in that sense, one of the things that really stands out for me in the book is when we talk about the atomic bomb and the 80th anniversary this month, we immediately leap to thinking about Japan and Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the end of the war in the Pacific. But the atomic bomb is entirely rooted in fascist Europe and the rise of Hitler's Third Reich. And it is, in fact, the motivating factor for these scientists is they know the German scientists left behind, like Werner Heisenberg, who they fear are at work themselves on an atomic bomb. And so their motivation, day in, day out, for most of the 3 years of the Manhattan Project is to build the atomic bomb before Hitler does.
You talk about Oak Ridge. There's a wonderful scene or discussion in the book about the young women in Oak Ridge, the high school graduates in the race. I think it's to produce plutonium, right?
Uranium, yeah.
And tell me about how that was important.
Yeah, and this is sort of, again, we're talking about the sort of industrial power of the United States and the role of, Ford Motor Company building bombers, or DuPont and Tennessee Eastman end up the big corporate players in the Manhattan Project. And in that Oak Ridge facility, Tennessee Eastman is looking around at what its labor workforce could be, as they need to hire, thousands and tens of thousands of workers in remote mountain Tennessee outside Knoxville. And they settle on high school girls from the surrounding community. That's who's left in the workforce by 43, 44. And you have all the fancy California, Berkeley PhDs saying, we don't think these women can actually operate these uranium refining machines called calutrons. And then they put them in a head-to-head test, and it turns out the teen girls in Tennessee outperform the California PhDs in uranium production. And what is just so incredible, again, about the secrecy of this is most of those women who were known at the time as calutron girls, worked on those, machines, 24 hours a day, 3 shifts a day, refining and creating uranium, and heard the word uranium for the first time when Harry Truman announces the existence of the Manhattan Project on August 6, 1945. They never knew what they were doing behind those machines, what was coming out the other side, and what they were contributing to the war effort.
When you talk about people not really knowing all the steps in the process that they were contributing to, that goes all the way up to Harry Truman, who I don't think knew about the making of the bomb until Franklin Roosevelt dies and Truman suddenly becomes president. Tell me how that secrecy worked.
Yeah, and this is, to me, one of the most amazing scenes in the book is Franklin Roosevelt dies in spring 1945. Harry Truman is sworn in, and Secretary of War Henry Stimson sort of stays after the first cabinet meeting with Truman and pulls Truman aside and says, "There's really something I should come talk to you about." And then sort of shows up with this briefing, where he brings Harry Truman into the fold for the first time about the existence of the Manhattan Project, the idea of an atomic bomb, and the fact that at that point they are mere weeks away from having the first working nuclear device in the world.
And there's a decision made to drop the bomb. But it's not actually a clear decision. It's not like they have a very formal process and Truman makes a decision. It seems almost as if just instinctual that he does it. How was that decision made, and did he have any regrets?
Yeah, I spent a lot of time in the book talking about what you might call the permission structure for the atomic bomb in the spring and summer of 1945, because we look back on that event as so singularly transformative. The only time we ever use these weapons in combat in human history. But at the time, we were involved in this incredibly brutal and deadly war with Japan. In that spring of 1945, Curtis LeMay is leading bombing missions against Japan, firebombing Tokyo in Operation Meeting House that spring, that kills 100,000 Japanese in a single night, the deadliest night of conflict in human history, and then goes on to bomb a total of 66 Japanese cities, single mission raids that are, destroying 30, 40, 50, 60, even 70% of these cities in single nights.
But did Secretary of War Henry Stimson, wasn't he one of the ones who kind of understood we were going into a new era if we dropped this bomb?
Yes, and they do understand that this is a bigger bomb, that this is a different type of weapon, but they don't necessarily think about it in the same sort of stark terms of civilian deaths that I think we now think of nuclear weapons.
So in retrospect, were we right to drop the first bomb in Hiroshima?
It's a really complicated question. I don't think we will ever satisfy it one way or another. I think all of the following are true. The dropping of the bomb certainly saves American lives. It probably saves Japanese lives. I mean, again, one of the things people lose sight of is Japan is in the midst of a naval blockade with widespread famine, and there are 200,000 Japanese civilians dying every month of starvation by the summer and fall of 1945. And at the same time, I think it is hard to look back and think that these are weapons we could ever use again. I mean, I think that there is...
But we used them again in Nagasaki a few days later. Was that justified?
I mean, in future conflicts, I think it is right that sort of the central defining organizing principle of geopolitics after the war becomes never using these weapons again.
Are you worried about that?
I'm very worried about it at this moment. And I think part of this moment in geopolitics is we lie a lot closer to nuclear danger than most people, I think, realize. We've already seen this year, a conflict between India and Pakistan, which are the two largest nuclear arsenals to ever come into open conflict. We've, of course, seen the U.S. and Israeli raids over Iran's nuclear problem. And we have seen, spreading conversations about nuclear proliferation in Europe and Asia as the U.S. appears to pull back from some of its geopolitical alliances.
You went through hundreds of accounts of the Japanese survivors of the bomb. Tell me what you learned from that and what that was about.
Yeah. The final chapters of this book, I go back and forth between the triumph of the American, Manhattan Project workers and the bomber crews that deliver these bombs, and then the tragedy on the ground in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The accounts from those cities are as searing as any memories I have ever come across in my historical research. And I think, again, one of the things I really wanted to do with this project is over the next few years, we will see the passing of the last survivors of those bombs. And it's important to me to carry their stories forward as a reminder about why these weapons are not like any other weapon in the human arsenal, and why we need to do everything that we can in our time to carry forward their dream that they are the last survivors of a nuclear weapon.
Garrett Graff, thank you so much for joining us.
Walter, always a pleasure.
Now to new sound for a multi-Grammy winning artist. Jacob Collier has been described as a colorful Mozart of Gen Z, blending musical genres from R&B to jazz. Well, now in his new album, The Light for Days, he's stripping it all back. Collier describes it as the scruffiest album he's ever made, written in just 4 days using the 5-string guitar.
Light up the stove of your countenance. You're all that matters to me.
Collier told our Hari Srinivasan about his inspiration for the project.
Bianna, thanks. Jacob Collier, thanks so much for joining us. Your most recent album, The Light for Days, took you only 4 days to record, and you used basically just one instrument. Why do this? And also, what's behind the title?
Yes, well, thank you so much for having me. This album was a drastic change from previous albums that I've made. I've spent the last 7 years mostly creating 4 radically collaborative albums, which are sort of explosively varied and multi-layered and sort of extravagant creatively. And I wanted a change, and so I imposed these 2 limitations, one being the one instrument, a 5-string guitar, and the second being 4 days, which is the amount of time I had to make the album. I was kicking off my tour in Asia back in May, and I had this little magical window, and I thought, well, what if I make a whole album within this window of time? So that's what I did. And the title, The Light for Days, is really existent for 3 reasons. One is it's a lyric in one of the songs, which is a song called Icarus by a band called The States. 4 days in it, which is just a ticklish sort of thing from my perspective. And third, I think we all need light in our days. And so this was a record that really provided a sense of calm for me, a sense of peace, and something I was really excited to share with the world.
So you have some covers from, some well-known names, James Taylor, the Beatles, to name the Staves, to name a few. And then you also come up with your own music, right? So I wonder, this is kind of maybe a strange question, but how is a song born in the mind of Jacob Collier? Well, what is it? Is it the lyrics that come first? Is it the tune? Well, how do you create something?
Yeah, it's a beautiful question, and I have to say, there's not one way. I think of music making a bit like world building. You're building something that feels believable with proportions and warmth and humanity and things. The thing with this particular album is that I had to work quick, so I had to sort of be quite decisive with my ideas. I'm the kind of person who can happily sort of agonize over certain kinds of creative decisions at times. So it was really refreshing for me to sort of jump in and say, look, whatever the first idea is, that's what I have to go with. And so it was a combination of the above. Sometimes it's a word, sometimes it's a chord or a sound, but often it's a sort of mood or a space that I'm trying to build a little world that correctly and accurately describes what that feels like for me.
Okay, I know it's like picking between your children to describe a favorite, so I want you to maybe help our audience understand a bit more about one of the tracks. One that caught my eye was a music video that you did with, it said no visual effects, so that means real butterflies were on your face. You were standing in some light storm in a jungle. Tell me about the song Heaven.
It's probably the most ticklish experience I've ever had in my whole life. It's really bizarre and really interesting, but Heaven, in brackets, Butterflies, is the second song on the album. And we actually shot a different video for each song on the album in a different location. So I've been touring all year, and I ended up in Costa Rica on the final day of the tour about 3 or 4 weeks ago, the tour that was in that region of the world. And we ended up in this butterfly kind of zone where they have all these butterflies that just want to play. Like they're really delighted by people. It's very warm, very, very warm song. Lots of voices in the background and guitars in the background. But yeah, that particular experience for me was really kind of like a one of one.
Because you've done so many different parts of music, you've arranged music, you've rearranged music that we might all be familiar with, you've used your own voice as an instrument, you play so many instruments, and I read that you described it yourself at times as an introvert, and so I wonder, is there something that's less enjoyable, more enjoyable for you to do? Is some part of the process, do you feel more at home and comfortable in it? And it's also, explain being an introvert and still being somebody who literally goes out on stage every night and in front of thousands of people.
Yeah, yeah, it's a great question. I'm comfortable with people. I enjoy people, but I think that I get most of my creative energy from being alone. I think we're all on a spectrum there, and so I totally am utterly in love with tour. I just love it so much. I love the feeling of being on stage and the feeling of hearing the audience sing and all these things. But I also know how important it is for me, just as an artist and person, to come back to my ultimate cave of self and kind of find those ways of recharging. So, when I was a small child, I never really had big dreams of touring and being a famous musician, anything like that. I just really wanted to make the most compelling music that I could, and I just loved music to the end of the earth. So
Yeah.
I kind of still feel like that. I feel like being able to tour and play these shows and collaborate with people is a huge bonus to a process that would already be happening, which is me making things that I care for and just trying to learn about how life and music all works.
For people who might not be familiar with your work, it sort of took on a whole different dimension about a dozen years ago, where you posted a video on YouTube of you basically redoing every part of an amazing Stevie Wonder song by yourself.
Don't you worry about it.
So you post that video. What happens next?
Well, I have a magical little room in my home in London, my family home, my child's home, where I recorded a lot of music as a child, and I layered lots of instruments on top of other instruments and voices on top of other voices, and so it was this sort of one-man band figure, and then one day I got an email from Quincy Jones, and this was a moment that absolutely blew my mind, and I was distinctly flabbergasted at the sort of friendship that unfolded thereafter with the great man. There's such an amazing sense that he has this access to humanity and infinity and joy, but he's also just one of my absolute greatest heroes. And he became a bit of a sort of godfather, mentor type figure for me. We lost the great man last year, and so now every note that I play on stage or I record in the studio feels like it has the essence of Quincy within.
Going back a bit further, I've heard you say that some of your earliest memories are watching your mom conduct an orchestra, because she's a musician, you're in a family of musicians. And I wonder whether, you're sitting there at 2 or 3 years old and you're just kind of soaking this up, and by osmosis, did it change your perception of music, or did you just think this is what people do? They wave their arms and then magical sounds appear.
Yes. I think that the fundamental lessons that were at play in watching my mother, Susie Collier, conduct weren't actually musical lessons at the heart of them. They were human lessons. Because what she was demonstrating was a kind of leadership model where she's completely unafraid of the freedom of the musicians around her and the openness and the collaboration. And they're not afraid of her either. So it's this fearless space. And as we all know, nothing prevents you from being creative more effectively than the fear of making a mistake, But I think I watched her create these amazing environments, social environments, musical environments, where people weren't afraid of making a mistake. They wanted to challenge the status quo. And she's a very unconventional kind of teacher and thinker, but the results that she got were so strong and so unequivocally brilliant, and sort of schooling all the other disciplinarians that would try and do the same thing. So I think that I didn't feel pressure as a child to be a musician. It wasn't like I had to be a musician in order to do the right thing, but it did feel somewhat inevitable that I'd explore music within my arsenal of human things to explore and do. And I think that as I've grown older, I've sort of accidentally fallen deeply in love with the idea of not conducting orchestras, but conducting audiences. And I've recently been incorporate many thousands of voices at my concerts and create these amazing sort of sound worlds. And I think a lot of the root of that comes from those early experiences. But I think I also recognized that music as something that I really loved is something that I wanted to give a lot of my time and attention to. So I did very actively decide that I wanted to really understand why these things make us feel so much. Music is this really mysterious thing, and I wanted to get to the heart of the matter.
Tell our audience a little bit about what you do at your shows. I mean, there's so many examples online of you really just somehow turning, it could be 100 people, it could be 100,000 people, into a choir. How does that happen?
Yeah, well, the idea with the audience choir is that everyone is a musician as long as they're participating, that, permission is more important than skill, first of all. But second of all, that it's possible to create a sort of musical context for people where they intuitively know where to move their note up and down. So the way the audience choir works is I'll have these people here, and I'll divide them. Sometimes I'll divide them into different groups. So say 3 groups, and I'll give three different notes as starting points. And then rather than singing or telling them what to do, I just move my hands up and down and watch that section. And they kind of move up and down accordingly. And what happens is this really majestic kind of emotional, it's like a huge organ of people, like a massive, massive musical instrument that's kind of like 10,000 pixels long or something. And it's based in people's intuitions and people's kind of faith in me, and I have total faith in them. And a lot of the time these are quite improvised, so the harmony and things can move into all sorts of interesting places. But I think that people really love to participate and are good at participating, but my job is to create the conditions where people don't feel worried about making a mistake, but also feel supported and understanding kind of where they are. There are also moments of total chaos with the audience where people will sing like 11 different notes and it sounds crazy and it sounds weird, and sometimes we do all sorts of other types of even non-harmonic effects, like sound effects and sounds of rain and storms and stamping, and it's a really, really visceral experimentation ground. I think my audience members know that they're coming to play. Yeah. And to me, it's become like a sort of unmissable part of the experience that gives me goosebumps every single time.
I think it's at the Kennedy Center, and you started improvising with the orchestra. And at that moment, I was just like, is his brain hearing everything already? I mean, do you already have the music in your brain and you're just moving the clarinets to do what you want? Or is your brain shifting and creating something new, knowing that this is the sound that this tuba is going to make, and this is this? I don't know. It was just like, I'm really trying to map your brain here. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, I think it depends on the style of improvisation. Sometimes I think that it does help to go in with a picture in your head. So with that particular example, when I improvised the orchestra with the NSO, that was something where I did have somewhat a plan of what I was going to do with the instruments, and I could hear it all in my head, and I just was trying to activate on it and get it the best I could. But as I iterated on my idea, which was a challenge that was set to me by a friend of mine, he said, why don't you just try making something with the orchestra with no plan? I thought, that's right up my alley. But as I went, you realize, certain things don't land as you're expecting them to land. I don't play all these instruments. So I think the fun thing there was going through the process and iterating and changing my mind. Oh, actually, no, clarinets, I think it's best if you stay on a G rather than go to the F. I think the G is better, and I think that people enjoy watching me not know what I'm doing as much as they enjoy watching me know what I'm doing. And I'm kind of comfortable in both spaces at this point enough to follow my nose and hopefully find something of interest.
I wonder if you think about where we are right now with where music is and how people discover music, right? On the one hand, the platforms like YouTube have given you a phenomenal opportunity, and lots of other musicians and creative artists have been given these opportunities and been discovered, so to speak, right? And at the same time, the sort of economic structure doesn't necessarily seem to value their creative work. You hear about musicians that have to have millions and millions and hundreds of millions of views to really try to make a living, or they have to go out on the road. And I wonder if, as a society, we're not necessarily supporting the creative community as much as we could, or maybe even did.
I couldn't agree more. It doesn't have to be like this. I think there are so many ways of structuring a society where the creative people are valued. I think it comes down to people in these sort of positions of high power not actually recognizing how foundationally crucial the arts are to a functional world. You've got so many people in the world right now who are looking for purpose, who are looking for answers to big unanswerable questions. You've got people who are just like looking for perspectives, looking for learning about the world, and people who want to feel. And the reality in the world today is there are a lot of people who would like us to feel so many different kinds of things, and you can't really tell someone what to feel. But what you can do is you can show someone what to feel. What the arts do is they give you a chance to feel things that you wouldn't otherwise feel if you were living in quote unquote reality all of the time. If you step into this other space, there's such a huge benefit to the way that we feel as people in growing and in changing and in evolving. And we really, really need our artists and our creatives and our musicians like we've never done before. So I think it does come down to that simple kind of valuation, like how much do we want people to spend their time making things in these ways. And to me, there's no more important thing, I think, to do right now other than to make things. It feels like a way of incorporating the world, a way of expressing the world, a way of building community and connection. I'm really hoping that we're moving towards a bit of a moment of change in society where we're recognizing how crucial it is for the artists to be able to not just survive, but actually to thrive too.
One of the other big changes kind of on the horizon right now is what artificial intelligence is doing and how it's kind of transforming lots of little parts of our lives. A lot of these models have been trained on the work and the intellectual property and creative juices, so to speak, of so many millions of people, right? So as a creator, I mean, how do you think about what this technology is doing? Do you use it as a tool? Do you think about it?
Yes, it's a really unprecedented thing to have access to. A thing of such extraordinary competence that the mind boggles. The interesting thing about art, which I'm coming to realize, is that competence doesn't mean something's good or meaningful. And I've got to say, over the last 3 years, AI has got more and more competent, and I've got less and less inspired by it, because nowadays everything's too realistic to be real, which is really a weird commodity. I think of the artist's role in society to ask questions. We're question askers. We're not answer providers. We ask questions. Now, AI is primarily accessed through prompts, through asking questions. So in a sense, I think artists are uniquely positioned to make meaningful things using whatever tools we have. AI is one such tool. I think that it takes nowadays a pretty interesting question to get an interesting answer, because your usual answer is super kind of down the line, very regimented and predictable. Artists thrive in the unpredictable. I think that humans thrive in the unpredictable, and I actually think we might be entering into a sort of unpredictability revolution somewhat, because I think that in an algorithmic world, we're free when we can't be predicted. And I think this is a feeling that artists can remind us of, is of being untethered to structures and ways of thinking. So I also think it's dangerous in its ways. I mean, you mentioned the ownership problem with regard to training data, which is really gnarly for musicians. It's so hard to kind of define that problem, and it's so hard to stop it, given how those models work, and how the more you feed them, the more capacious they become. So there are a number of issues that I perceive, but I do have faith in the imperfections of people being our sort of saving grace, and how I think that an imperfect person will always need another imperfect person to relate to. And if the role of an artist is to be related to and to build worlds you can trust, I think that role will always have a place.
All right. Jacob Collier, thanks so much for your music and for your time.
Thank you, sir.
To a crisis facing public education in America. Students' reading and math scores are reaching historic lows. And according to our next guest, the cause of this decline isn't as obvious as you'd think. New York Magazine's Andrew Rice joins Michelle Martin to explain.
Thanks, Bianna. Andrew Rice, thank you so much for talking with us.
Thank you.
You open your piece with some of the latest findings for the National Assessment of Educational Progress. This is considered kind of the gold standard, figuring out, how kids are doing academically. And these results showed, this is over the past year, and it showed that 40% of fourth graders and a third of eighth graders scored below basic in reading. And that on the most recent 12th grade math assessment, about 3/4 of high school seniors could not correctly add the cost of 6 lunch items and calculate a 20% tip. And I was just wondering, since you write about a lot of things, what made you take a look at this?
I mean, I think really it began with a personal question that I had, which is, I have a son who's in 8th grade. He's 13 years old. He spent the pandemic, about 18 months almost during the pandemic, in and out of school. His education was quite disrupted during that time period. And so afterwards, I always kind of wondered, what would the long-term educational consequences of this be? There weren't a lot of precedents for it in the academic literature. And so, I just kept reading these articles that described these really sobering, maybe even catastrophic sounding declines in education now, or in educational achievement. I discovered that in fact the story was a lot more complicated than I imagined when I started out. That really people were studying these declines, and they are really drastic, and they did really accelerate during the pandemic. But they began before the pandemic, and they've continued in many categories after the pandemic, which makes it obvious that that there's something else deeper going on here.
One of the most alarming findings in your piece is the reversal of decades of progress. In 2015, this is according to your piece, in 2015, fourth graders performed a full grade level above their counterparts in 2000. Yet almost a decade later, those students were registering all-time lows in reading in high school. So what happened here?
There are a couple different theories about what happened and why, but the best clue that we have is timing. The downturn started in about the middle of the last decade, and then that leads us being the people who are I think educational scholars who I talk to, I guess, it leads them to a couple different potential theories. One of them, a real obvious and maybe intuitive one to most people or most parents of a teenager like me, is screens. A lot of people just think that, well, the iPad was invented or introduced to the public in 2010, and those kids hit the education system around 2015, and that's when test scores started to go down. So maybe that's just the simple answer. But as I noted in the story, there's a lot to suggest that there's something deeper going on, something else about the system itself, because the declines are not evenly distributed. They're distributed unevenly to kids who are scoring the lowest. So the kids who were scoring the lowest for a long time were making up ground and gaining ground, and essentially. The way the academics that I talked to described it is like, think of it as a fan. For a long time, the fan was kind of getting closer together. What's happened now is the fan is spreading back out, and all of these gaps, especially the achievement gaps between white students and black students, especially, have started to widen. The achievement gap, the math achievement gap, gender gap between girls and boys has started to widen again. All of these sort of old, long-standing inequities have reasserted themselves. So because it's unevenly distributed, we have to start asking questions about what the schools are doing and what they're doing differently. And that's what my story really tried to go deep into.
Some of these anecdotes that you describe in your piece are really a bummer. I mean, just tell me a couple of stories that some of the educators told you about what they're seeing in the classroom.
One of the things I thought was sort of the scariest as a parent is the talking with folks about the way that grading standards have slackened. A lot of teachers told me that there's just been a softening of expectations, and they just don't expect children at all sorts of different levels to be able to perform in the same way that they used to. And the reason that's scary to me as a parent of a teenager is that grades are one of the 2 or 3 pieces of metrics that you can use as an outsider to try to gauge how your child is doing. Test scores are another. But one of the things I heard was this phenomenon of what they call beeflation, which is basically, kids are just getting B's for doing less work than they used to. Similarly, just hear stories about teachers who say that they can't ask children to read books on grade level, that they should be able to read at their grade level anymore. Hearing stories about a teacher in a school for gifted students, actually, and in a magnet school in New Jersey, she says that she used to ask them to take 15 minutes to read a short story. Now it takes 40 minutes, maybe even close to a whole period. We're hearing these reports from people inside the building. These are not, interest groups that are trying to advocate a political agenda. These are actually people who are practitioners who are raising the alarm and saying something's wrong here.
The other thing that you point out in the piece that I think a lot of people will be interested in is that the steepest academic declines are not happening in traditionally underfunded, or we'll say conservative regions that have not traditionally invested in education equally, especially for groups that have been historically marginalized, right?
I mean, and it's true. We're talking really about southern states here. Mississippi is one, Louisiana is another. These are states that are not, to put it mildly, do not have a good civil rights record. But if the NAEP scores, the National Assessment Scores, show that today an economically disadvantaged fourth grader in Mississippi scores better than an economically disadvantaged fourth grader in Massachusetts or New Jersey, traditionally high-performing states.
Exactly. Places that publicly pride themselves on valuing education, spend a lot of money on education, and historically, at least publicly, value equity. You focus on a place that you know well where you live, which is Montclair, New Jersey, which spends a little more than $27,000 per pupil per year, right? Achievement has dropped by a grade level in reading and by half a grade in math since 2013. What made you take a look at that? Was that kind of the logical extension of, like, I wonder what's happening in my own backyard?
One of the things that really inspired me to do it is that there was as you alluded to a second ago, our district spends, in the 95th percentile in the country per pupil on education. And yet we have not made much of any progress closing the achievement gap. The achievement gap in our town, which is actually pretty racially diverse, has gotten wider since the pandemic, especially in math. And meanwhile, we just found out over the summer, that we have a gigantic budget deficit that we didn't know about. So in fact, even as we're not getting results, we've also been spending much more money than we budgeted for education. And consequently, the whole community is having this very difficult conversation about whether we're getting the results that we're paying for from the system, and whether we've allowed the system to atrophy, and whether we've perhaps prioritized things in our spending that don't necessarily go towards learning and go towards closing achievement gaps and go towards preparing students to really thrive in college and in the rest of their lives.
You quote a superintendent who says, "Our budget reflects our priorities. I don't know how much of our priority teaching and learning has honestly been." So what has the money been going to?
Districts are spending more money on ancillary things that they didn't in years past than they ever have been before. If you talk with teachers, they'll often tell you that the schools and teachers themselves are being asked to do more than they have ever done before. There's an article that just out in the New York Times about how classifications for special education and anxiety diagnoses and depression diagnoses have really just gone through the roof in a lot of schools. And so that means schools are hiring counselors. That means that a lot more kids have IEPs and other forms of special education classifications, which mean having to hire more teachers, more personnel to address those deficits. Again, it's not a monocausal situation, but it all starts to add up. And what you end up getting is a situation in which we have ever inflating costs for public education. And crucially, I think important to note, under Republican Governor Chris Christie in the middle of the last decade, the state also put in a cap on how much municipalities can raise their property taxes, which finance schools, of 2%. So, you can do the math. Inflation is going up faster than 2% in everything: buses, personnel, every aspect of education. And the school districts, at least here in New Jersey, and this is not uncommon throughout the country, have a hard cap of how much they can raise money, and it means that they end up having to always be doing more with less.
Okay, but how does this explain the fact that some of these southern states that traditionally have not invested as heavily in public education, their kids seem to be doing better?
There are a couple different theories. One has to do with curriculum and continuing teaching of phonics and so on. Others have to do with teacher training. But a really big one that I address at length in the story is this idea that the more conservative states never really backed away from a system of what was called accountability for schools, largely based on test scores, although not exclusively based on test scores. But there's a long period of time when Republicans and Democrats alike had a sense that they would set high standards for schools and hold them to those high standards, rewarding them when they met them or exceeded them. And there were incentives and disincentives that set up around these accountability benchmarks. And so the southern states, by and large, have kind of stuck with that. A lot of the liberal northeastern states, especially since the pandemic, have moved away from using test scores in that way. Lots of complicated reasons for that, but a big one is a federal law signed by Barack Obama in 2015 that really delegated a lot of authority to the states. 2015, if you remember from what we were just talked about, we talk about the mystery of this inflection point where things started to go down. What happens to the people who believe in what I call the declining standards hypothesis point to the signing of this law in 2015 as the kind of turning point in which educational achievement started to go in the wrong direction. And so if you want to think about what might be going wrong or what we might be able to fix, that might be a good place to start. I think a lot of the people in this education reform movement would say.
Some people forget just how heated these arguments were over, in George W. Bush's administration, his kind of No Child Left Behind initiative. And a lot of people kind of in the educational policy world, teachers unions were sort of furious about it. They thought, this is, teaching to the test. You're going to drive all the joy and passion out of teaching and the creativity. It's going to be all about the test. It's all about the test. But sort of now looking at it, do you think that there's been any kind of a change of heart?
I think everything that you said about sucking joy out of the classroom and teaching to the test and incentivizing cheating and so on, these are all real things and real downsides to the No Child Left Behind regimen. So I'm not in any way sort of romanticizing, what there was before. But as always with any kind of policy change, there are unintended consequences. What one education policy specialist told me, in the course of doing this, that in 2015, when Obama signed the law reforming No Child Left Behind, he said, there's widespread anticipation that we're moving to something better, and it turned out we're moving to something much worse.
One of the things you say in your piece, which is also surprising to me, is you reference work by an Ohio State University professor, Vladimir Kogan, showing that school boards are often elected by, quote, mostly childless, overwhelmingly white upper-income voters, unquote, creating what he calls a democratic deficit. So how is that possible?
A lot of people vote for school boards based on their taxes, based on there's in any community, I think the number of parents in any given community is not necessarily going to be a majority, because just by the nature of demographics. You have a lot of people whose children are not entered the system yet. You have a lot of people who don't have children, and so the electorates are not made up primarily or exclusively of parents. I also think, to be candid about it, that I think that in a lot of places, there's even parents who should be the most invested in the system, there's a sense of disconnection, of oftentimes these are very low turnout elections, and oftentimes parents have no idea that there's anything wrong. So, now, for instance, in my community in Montclair, there are people starting, public advocacy groups. There are WhatsApp groups that are, getting together to talk about all these issues, print up yard signs, try to get people to the polls for this referendum where we're voting on potential tax increase in a week from now. But I would say, just candidly, I think the percentage of those people, those same people who were paying attention 6 months ago, 9 months ago, a year ago to what was going on in the schools was quite small. And so I think that, these are things you have to make a lot of effort to pay attention to. I know from having tried to make some effort to pay attention to them that the systems are not easy. It's not easy to go to a 4-hour school board meeting on a weeknight if you're a working parent. So anyway, the point is that we get the system that we get in part because the system is set up to make us to make us disinvested in it.
Andrew Rice, thanks so much for talking with us.
Thanks a lot.